Welcome to the Education Super Session by IIM-Ahmedabad and IIIT Bangalore Faculty. Challenges of Inclusivity and Equity in EdTech Interventions. My name is Ankur and I work as a research associate at CSR Box. Before we begin, we have a few instructions for our participants. Since we are using a virtual platform, you might experience time lag. In case you get logged out of the meeting due to a technical issue, please use the same link to rejoin. To avoid disturbance, keep your microphone on mute and video off unless you are asked to speak. Please use the chat box and the question answer feature to ask any questions to our panelists. In today's session, we will discuss IT interventions in education to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots by democratizing education, with a special focus on socio-economic diversity and children with special needs. We will also discuss the challenges of inclusivity and equity in EdTech interventions. I take immense pleasure in introducing the 4 facilitators for today's session, starting with Professor Kathan Shukla, Faculty, Ravi J. Matthai Center of Educational Innovation, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Professor Shukla is a faculty member in Ravi J. Matthai Center of Educational Innovation at IIM-Ahmedabad. His work emphasizes on the synergy of methodological rigor and in-depth substantive inquiry of educational problems, and his primary substantive interest lies on school climate and students' academic and psychological outcomes. Methodologically, his research focuses on the applications of contemporary quantitative techniques, educational testing and measurement, scale development and validation. Welcome, Professor Kathan. Next, we have Professor Rajesh Chandwani, Faculty, Human Resource Management, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He has served as a pediatrician in public health institutes in remote rural and urban areas, primary and tertiary centers, and has also rendered voluntarily through an NGO after completing his MD Pediatrics from Baroda Medical College. His current research interests include the use of information technology to enhance the effectiveness of healthcare personnel and healthcare delivery, scaling up of affordable and quality healthcare services for the underprivileged. Welcome, Professor Rajesh. Next, we have Professor Amit Prakash, Associate Professor and Convener, Center for IT and Public Policy, International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore. Professor Prakash is in the core team of the eHealth Research Center in IIITB. He was actively involved in designing a unique and interdisciplinary master's program in digital society at IIITB, where he presently teaches courses in the areas of ICT and development, e-governance, and social complexity of systems thinking to students of its postgraduate programs. Welcome, Professor Prakash. Next, we have Professor Ankur Sarin, who is a faculty Public Systems Group at IIM-Ahmedabad. Professor Sarin is a faculty member of the IIM-Ahmedabad Public System Group, Ravi J. Matthai Center for Innovation in Education and Economic Areas. He has worked as a principal investigator on research projects with organizations like America India Foundation Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Central Square Foundation, Pratham Education Foundation, Selco Foundation, UNICEF, and Video Volunteers. He has also been part of the core evaluation teams of the National E-Governance Program India and the Mahila Samakhya Program for the Government of India. We welcome you, Professor Sarin. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for joining us today. And before we begin, I would like to remind you that the session ends at 3:45 p.m. and we will ring a buzzer when we have 5 minutes left for the session to end. Over to you.
Okay, so.
And I would request Professor Kathan Shukla to start with the session.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajesh, for making me part of this. I'll be sharing my screen because I want to present. Okay, now you all can see the screen, right? All right, so basically today, I wanted to talk about this very interesting question. EdTech has been doing quite a bit of, there has been a significant progress in the sector. However, still, there is a sense that it's on the periphery of the entire school education system. So in today's session, I'll sort of present to you why do I think that. And then we'll kind of explore some of the way out of this. So first thing is about that EdTech companies tend to focus on these 4 broader buckets. So first one is about educational pedagogy and teaching aids. So mainly focusing on the teaching learning practices, and then from pedagogical point of view, it's mostly about delivering the content to the student. Or it can be any learner. And then teaching aids can be all sorts of different devices or different tools that these companies provide to the students and even to the teachers. There could also be interventions for teachers, so teachers' professional development, but that's also part of this broader bucket. Second big area is about curriculum representation. So, well, there is this existing curriculum, but then you sort of write textbooks in much more user-friendly manner. So that could be interesting. Storytelling component to it. A lot of characters are developed in order to present the content in more sort of child-centric manner. But the idea is to work with the curriculum and make it more conducive for learning. Third is a component where, to be frank, there are fewer companies, and that is about educational assessment, where the idea can be to assess students, to diagnose where the learning gaps are, and then to provide feedback to the students, to the parents, to the teachers, in order to, once the gaps are identified, and then you may have that remedial program. So, for example, educational assessment, educational initiative has been one big player in this particular area. And fourth sort of bucket is about this range of ancillary services. So that can include some of the tools for school administration, making more efficient functioning in the school, some sort of communication platforms that connects the parents, the teachers, the principals, and so that sort of platform. There are also a lot of players who are now thinking about going beyond the curriculum and targeting STEM skills, so science, technology, mathematics skills in students. Similarly, the focus is also there on the reading skills. Some of the skills where the perception is that you can find a lot of consumers. Okay. So, however, now let's look at the sort of existing scenario and then the broader scheme of things. So at present, we have this kind of structure where on the right side, it says assessment practice. So this is not specific to one school board, but it is across different boards in India. Whether you look at the CBSE, the central board, or whether you look at various state boards. Of course, there will be some variation in how these exams are prepared, but overall, the tendency tends to be for having for focusing on lower levels of cognition, mainly understanding and knowledge level of cognition. And of course, increasingly there is some interest in application based, but then that is kind of marginal. And hence, the key to success in let's say, board exams becomes like you reproduce a model response in timely manner, so so then you can score really well in the exams. So linked to that, if that's the idea of success, then when we observe what our students are doing when they are actually studying, so this is what they are doing. They are either preparing some sort of model response from all possible questions, and they could also then be practicing rewriting the text without looking at the source. So just writing, but without looking at it. So in a way, they're trying to memorize. Now, memorization itself is not a wrong thing. Okay? You may have really thorough understanding, and then you may memorize. But at some times, you may also have memorization without understanding, and that's what we call as rote learning. But in any case, memorization becomes a bit important, mainly because you have to cover all the points which are there in the model response and rewrite those points in order to achieve full score. So that is what our students are doing. So when we complain that, let's say, our students are not going to the museum, they are not exploring things, they are not driven by inquiry, mainly because that's the system that we have set up. And then in order to encourage this behavior of learning, no wonder teachers are then focusing on the lecture method with all its flaws. Lecture method is one of the most efficient methods to achieve this specific objective. And the focus tends to be on the course completion, and also teachers also end up encouraging that memorization, which will be sort of key to success in order to achieve, let's say, full score on the exam. So that is the sort of, when we, with all the great discussions and big ideas about education, when we actually look at what is happening in the name of education in our schools, so this is the dominant pattern. Of course, there are great exceptions. There could be some fantastic teachers, some fantastic schools which could be doing some great work, but this is the dominant pattern that we observe. And to support that, you have parents also. So if a parent is really involved with the academic work, the parent would in fact encourage the child to do this sort of preparing model response, rereading it, rewriting it. So that is what parent would also encourage the child to do. And then that also gives a great scope for a entire tutoring and coaching industry. Mainly because what they do, they actually provide you some sort of learning materials. So in a way, this first step of students learning, it's readily available now. So most coaching centers you see, they are going to provide you very concise notes, okay, some bullet points. And once you have that, so now student just has to understand and memorize those points and then rewrite without looking at the source. So that makes your job a bit easier. And then coaching centers also do a lot of drill practice. So that's why it's called an industry. So it's that sort of industrial model to learning. And then this context does not exist in isolation. Let's look at the bigger picture now. So teachers, their conditions. Now this is more about the government school, the public school system. But then there is also it's not so different from what we see in affordable private schools. So that's why this is the discussion about the dominant pattern that we observe. So teachers tend to have really poor pre-service education. There are really harsh working conditions. So maybe out of 6 hours in the school, they could be constantly in the class for about 5 hours, hardly a 30-minute break in a day. So constantly, there is hardly any time budgeting for lesson planning or any sort of other activities. And then we all know that there's not really well-defined tenure track. So, once you are entering it as a teacher, then probably the assumption would be this is what you'll be doing for the rest of your life. So limited professional growth opportunities, and also there is limited autonomy, mainly because even the boss, the principal, does not have that sort of autonomy, because principal is overburdened by the bureaucracy of the system, and then a lot of responsibilities for the entire school, but with very limited autonomy. You can't really hire people, you can't really fire people. Again, I'm mostly talking about the public school systems. And also you have little say in securing resources for your school. Because other people would be managing, would be deciding for you. Step above is this district level, the block level administrators. Now, they are not really solving the problem of the school, but they are actually solving problems of their heads. So what ends up happening, they end up being the hand and eyes of the state administrator. So whatever the state administrator wants them to do, so they'll be doing it. They'll get you all the data from the schools. So their entire energy goes into some sort of monitoring and executing the orders that they receive from the top. And hence, when then we look at this state administrator, so most Indian states in a way function as one giant school with classes spread across the entire state. Okay, the entire centralized planning, including the academic calendar, decisions about hiring, firing, transfers, designing curriculum, the textbooks, and then all the teaching aids that you are supposed to use, even the teaching manual that you are supposed to do, everything happens at the state level. And then, so now that we make sense of it, so the broader purpose of this entire system would be, so in this functional sense, the idea of a successful system would be that every year, if all the students that enter into this class 1, all the students then gradually progress, and then from class 12, if everybody is passing this assessment, the board exam successfully, then you would say that the system is successful based on what we have currently. Now, the thing is that current education, and hence, when that is the criteria of assessing the entire educational system in our context, so then the focus becomes on the enrollment rates, dropout rates, the graduation rate, so in fact, high school graduation rate, and pass rate, and the board pass rate. So these are the indicators that the policymakers are working with. So within that, educational technology, it plays very sort of peripheral role. It is not really changing anything in this entire educational ecology. It just does something bit here, bit here. Mainly, it tries to solve some of the problems of learners or teachers who are not really comfortable with this existing system. So if, let's say, somebody wants to learn beyond what is being done in the classroom, then the EdTech will provide some sort of solution. If somebody wants to go beyond this sort of lecture method and, let's say, focusing on course completion, and then somebody wants to do more than that, then there would be some sort of educational technology technological tool available for it. So it is solving all this other sort of problems, people who in a way fall off the system. But the mainstream, the majority of what your schools are doing, what your people in this system are doing, EdTech is still not able to challenge the system, and then the system also has a lot of inertia. So there is hardly any movement. As of now, I don't see any movement happening to disturb the current scenario. Okay, but why then EdTech shies away? So I have kind of two speculations. The first one, that most EdTech players, they have experienced the system from a student's perspective or as from teacher's perspective. So either they have been a teacher at some point, or maybe, of course, everybody has been a student at some point, so they think that they understand the system. But that is a very limited view, limited experience of the system. Then whatever problems you identify at students level or at teachers level. So all the solutions also are either for the student or the teacher. You're not then going beyond this entire picture. So you just stay within this student and the teacher, within only these two human resources and whatever problems that they face. Another speculation is about this, large number. So, business people often like to, what's the consumer base? Okay, so there are millions of students, lakhs of teachers. So then all the solution, you are not then thinking about solving the problems, but you are thinking about the consumer. because there is huge market. So let's take up the problems that they face, right? Because if your solution is at the BRC level, or let's say at the district level, now you would say that there are very few people. However, the problems are not just faced by one state. It's faced by across India, not just India, across developing world. So our EdTech is right now not thinking at any of these other levels, and then the scale that can serve not just in Indian state and Indian consumers, but then beyond that. Because whatever problems that we are facing, high chances that the many other countries in the other parts of the developing world are also facing, but then we are not really solving the system level problems. And third one is about that, after all, EdTech players are also, in a way, they are part of the system, and they get into the trap of how the system has defined education, right? Successful education would be the pass rate in the board exams, your decreasing the dropout rates, your high enrollment rates. So those are the things, even that sort of trap even is set up for the EdTech players. Okay, and hence the question about what should be the educational experience of children, that sort of remains unexplored. There is not much thinking about that when we think about the challenging the system. So I'll very quickly sort of summarize some of the work that we have done at Ravi Matthai, and it's kind of ongoing work. So we have kind of explored this question. Let's not buy into the definition of how the system is defining schooling experience. Let us think about that. What different dimension should be captured in a child's schooling experience. So these are all these broader dimensions that we are mentioning here. So on the green, all the greens are actually the outcomes, the academic outcomes. It's not just a pass rate, but it's of course the academic outcomes are of different subjects, that is important. But then we are also looking at educational aspirations, MSLQs, motivated strategies for learning. So how much interested you are in learning, and then psychological outcomes. So that can include depressive symptoms, academic stress, some of the delinquent behaviors. One thing you would notice that all of this are measurable. So we have developed tools to measure all the dimensions that we have presented here. We also capture student surveys, teacher surveys, assessments of the principals, perceptions, and all of this combined together would give a really in-depth look at children's schooling experience. And then of course, the directionality is in a way hypothesis. So you can hypothesize that a child who is doing academically well and who has very positive psychological profile would be less likely to drop out of the school. So within that, student engagement with the school also becomes really critical, and so does safety, student safety perception in the school. And then to predict this outcome, I'm not going to into deeper discussion on different dimensions, but if there are, so we can probably discuss in the question answer session. So I'll be happy to discuss at that point. Coming back to this, but then now the question was that in order to influence the outcomes that we are presenting on the right side, what are the factors within school that, let's say, teachers and principal or the policymakers, they can manipulate, they can do something about it. You may notice here that we have not put socio-economic status of children. Of course, it influences student outcomes. However, we do not control that, right? That it's difficult to change SES, socio-economic status. Hence, in the model, it's not there. But for example, disciplinary structure of the school, you can do something about it. Teaching learning practices in the classroom, you can do something about it. Similarly, you can provide more support to students. You can work on developing the community relations in the school, relationship between students, teachers, principal. You can work on this, building the school community. And then, of course, school management and leadership that can tie up with all these different sub-factors that are presented here. So what we do, we provide school assessment reports based on all these dimensions of school climate to the schools. So each school would receive how they have been doing on this, what are the perceptions of students and teachers on all these school dimensions of that children experience. And then similar reports are also generated at the BRC, at the district BRC level, at the district level, and at the state level. So now what it does, one thing it does, it sets up, it sort of sets up it opens up the criteria. Now don't just look at one narrow pass rate, look at the child's experience of the school, and then we can share you some intelligence on what you can do in order to improve those experiences. So in the report we also provide some of the specific strategic advice. If you want to improve disciplinary structure in your school, these are some of the things that school like yours in similar geographical, similar student demographic profile, similar school has done this kind of things in order to improve disciplinary structure or in order to improve student-teacher relationships. All these different dimensions, that sort of intelligence we can share. And then the idea is to assess every term. So for our next 3 years. So in the next cycle of assessment, the school will also get that compared to our previous assessment, how have we improved? How are we doing now? Have we improved our school children's experience of school, or are we still at the same point across these different dimensions? So this also helps them reduce bullying, teasing behavior in the school, engaging students academically in the classrooms, improving teaching practices, creating this academic culture in the school with higher discipline structures as well as higher support systems for the schools. So that sort of, see, in your hard security literature, you talk about intelligence sharing, you have military intelligence sharing. But here it's like educational intelligence sharing. So this sort of intelligence is shared with the school. Similarly at PRC level, district level, districts would also get some sort of idea about how schools within that districts are doing. And then after 6 months, they'll again get a report on that districts. So then they can check themselves that have they done anything to improve schooling experience of children, and then what sort of support they should provide to the schools. So that is the idea. And then we also hope that we continue this sort of assessment and then work with so we have also developed interventions where we work with all personnel of a school. So they sit together and they only form their plans, how they want to improve all these different dimensions that make child's schooling experience. And then we help them reassess and then interpret the findings every 6 months. So over time, the idea is that once the mechanism is there, people would want to improve learning experiences, overall schooling experiences of the children. So this is a vehicle through which they can be on a track for self-correcting mechanism. So the school does not have to copy some other school, but then can assess the previous point and then work on then come up with own reform plan. So that's the broader idea. This is just, I'm sharing the email address if there are any questions, concerns. Of course, I see that there are some of the questions and comments in the chat. It's just that I wasn't able to see that, but I'll be happy to discuss. And I'll now stop my presentation here. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to me. Hello.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathan sir. And now I request Professor Amit Prakash.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Rajesh, and audible?
Yes, sir. Audible.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh, and thank you for inviting me to this session. It's a pleasure to talk here, and especially after Kathan was laid out the entire educational ecosystem quite well here. What I will do is I'm mindful that we are slightly running behind schedule, and I'll try to finish in the next 8 to 10 minutes. What I'll do is I'll talk about 3 projects which look at IT or ICTs and education, largely in the public school system, the government schools in Karnataka, and see what lessons or what is it that we can get from there. Yes. So what I'll do is I'll quickly start with this conception of knowledge that most of us would be familiar with. Knowledge is not only explicit, so which means it is not only a codified form of knowledge which can be present in textbooks, but there's also a strong element of tacit knowledge that is present, and that requires individual actions, experience, and to a certain extent is in a non-codified form. And when we are looking at knowledge dissemination, we need to be mindful of both these aspects of knowledge. And taking off from there, if we look at our national curriculum framework, we see that the NCF that we have does acknowledge knowledge as a process of construction. And the process of construction incorporates the tacit dimensions that is there in literature and has been discussed in while looking at knowledge in different bodies of work. Now, in a constructivist learning paradigm, every learner is supposed to individually and socially, so in a group, construct meaning as they go about the learning process. And this positions the learner as an active participant in the learning process. So it's not only the teacher and the textbook that are considered sources of knowledge, but it is also the learner and his or her individual and social context that leads to constructing knowledge as one goes about the entire process. The learner's active participation, it involves peer interactions, and in, say, schools, it also involves student-teacher interactions. And what we are trying to do in the next, or what we have done in the next 2-3 projects that I'll be talking about is see how the technology that is being used is leading to enabling an increased student interaction or an increased interaction within the classroom. So that's the lens I'll be taking rather than a macro view that was taken in the earlier presentation. So as I was mentioning in the national curriculum framework also, the constructivist notion of learning has been talked about. It envisions the teacher's role as that of a facilitator and not the instructor, and not an instructor who is the sole custodian of all knowledge that exists. And therefore, I quote the NCF, it says, allowing children to ask questions that require them to relate what they are learning in school to things happening outside, encouraging children to answer in their own words and from their own experiences, rather than simply memorizing and getting answers right in just one way, unquote, is what a teacher as a facilitator is expected to do. Now, with that brief background, I'll get into 3 projects. I'll talk about 3 projects. I have been looking at these projects along with some of my colleagues and co-researchers over the last 7-8 years. The first project is a Tele-Education project that I'll be talking about. This is being rolled out across the state of Karnataka. To start with, amongst the most backward taluks. The second one is a more concentrated project that's in one taluk, 200 schools in one taluk of the state. And this is being rolled out by an educational NGO. And the third one is even more localized. It's about 10 schools in the city of Bangalore. So the first one, which I call, I am not taking names here. So this is a Tele-Education Project. It is looking at ICT-enabled blended learning, and it is being implemented at about 1,000 rural schools in Karnataka. The aim is to increase proficiency in science, maths, and English among class 5th to class 10 students. And it is designed and executed by a consortium led by a prominent higher education institute in Bangalore. There are 3 private companies involved. They create content, they handle the ICT infrastructure and human resources, and the overall project is being coordinated by the state's Department of Educational Research and Training. The features are the live lectures of 40 minutes, which are broadcast in 6 slots. The televisual broadcast includes a live image of the instructor, a larger display for animation and printed text, etc. Yeah, and the lecture is created by a team of what is considered well-qualified instructors in Bangalore, and one among them delivers the lecture. So this is how the students in the schools would consume a lecture like this. So there'll be a projector in a room, and the lecture, which is broadcast from the central studio in Bangalore, would be projected there, and the students would sit and see what the instructor has to say. So that's the first project I was talking about. Broadly, if we look at, say, broad findings of whatever we did, it was largely talking to students, teachers, even instructors who were broadcasting the sessions. We found that there was an inability of the teacher to observe student reactions, and this was considered quite problematic by those who were taking these sessions. The instructors also highlighted the lack of access to non-verbal cues, which is an important source of feedback, immediate feedback to teachers. And this led to this inability to immediately observe student responses, resulted in an instructional pace and choice of content and examples particularly that was not very appropriate for the students in most of the schools. The other important aspect was something that the literature terms as vicarious interaction. So this is a form of interaction where a student learns when other students ask questions, or when the instructor responds to other students' questions, or when there's a discussion that goes on in the classroom in an educational mode like the one I just talked about. This was seriously limited, and it was only say pushed to a designated question and answer session, which with 1,000 schools was again a big problem. To overcome some of these constraints, the school teachers emerged as very important, and their presence was always looked upon by the students as a comfortable source of information to bridge some of the gaps that they had because of the absence of a physical interaction with the instructor. So let me move on to the next project. This project is run by, these names are anonymized, run by a NGO, a fairly large NGO which works in more than 8 states in the country. The aim is to improve quality of education in government schools. The component that I'll be talking about is a digital learning room setup. It employs facilitators to support and enable teachers in using the digital learning room, and it is operational in over 200 schools in rural Karnataka across 3 taluks of Tumkur district, which is about 80 kilometers from Bangalore. This is the typical setup, not very different from what you would have seen in the earlier one. So you have a room where you have there is a laptop, there's a projector, there's a screen where content that is created by this NGO is played out. And the content that is created is because of smaller size and smaller, geography, and a more, localized geography, is in a form that is more relatable by the students in that taluk. So one difference from the earlier intervention is that the level of centralization is much lesser. Rather than looking at state as a unit of uniform content, here the content is being created at a taluk level. And then there's one more difference. The school teachers are allowed to use this content and modify the content if they so wish, to incorporate even more localized and relevant aspects that they may consider useful. So what we find here is the constraint in using the DLR in terms of infrastructure that has anyway been talked about. So similar kinds of constraint exist here, but because of a localized nature, the kind of response times in addressing some of these issues was a bit more. This digital medium, the digital learning room, given the constraints Kathan was talking about in his presentation of teachers and school infrastructure, is seen as a time-saving instrument by the teachers. And teachers, most of you would be aware, get pulled into all other administrative responsibilities, which includes elections, which includes voting lists, census, and the likes. And in the midst of all that, and a content which is digitally created and curated for their school by this NGO is seen as a time-saving instrument. So in most cases, what has been observed is, rather than the teachers using this content as a part of their classroom, interaction, they play it and then they leave it. They go out or do something else so as to take care of all the other pressures that they go through. Even when they're using it, it's not enabling a lot of interaction. It's still authoritative because the teacher is controlling the pace of the class. And ICTs, while it is accepted as an object of interaction, is not being used to enable a lot of classroom interactions as the NCF would want us to in most of the cases. So what we see is, while the use of information and communication technology triggers excitement, particularly because of the visuals and the video, it does not translate to meaningful interaction in the classroom. So for most part, it is preserving and propagating the status quo, especially in terms of the student-teacher relationships. The third project is a project where we are working with a group of special schools for the visually impaired in Bangalore. And in this school, the intent is to look at computational thinking, and this is also being incorporated now at the national level as an important skill. And in order to impart this skill, in order that the students get exposed to a skill like this, the modality that is being used is a learning through play approach. So we are looking at a ludic design framework, and this explicitly says that learning needs to incorporate play elements where children are active participants of the learning process and they're not passive recipients. So in the sense of where it is coming from, it appears to be very closely connected to the philosophy behind NCF and a constructivist paradigm. So what we see here is the instructors, so there are issues in terms of, so these are smaller groups. The instructors, they use both digital and the conventional, techniques and tools. But what they do is they play along with small group of children. And in doing so, what we have observed is the children enjoy this. So it's fun for them. It ensures that they, or it kind of makes them more curious to express whatever they feel about the session without inhibition. We do observe some improvements in learning. There are these collaborative learning, social skills that get done, and creativity gets fostered and unique ideas emerge. So even if the play is about addition, there may be something about multiplication that the children get exposed to or come up with while engaging in the process of play. So what I'm trying to kind of conclude here is looking at these three types of projects where digital technologies are being used. There are variants of these projects that exist across the country and elsewhere. But if we were to look at, say, a tele-education kind of project where you have a centralized content, where you have a centralized delivery, our experience has not been all that great, especially when it comes to facilitating classroom interaction and enabling constructivist learning. In terms of the second one, which is slightly more decentralized, more localized, in the presence of an environment where teachers don't get enough time, or they're not provided the right kind of infrastructure, they may be constrained not to use it for the purposes for which it is intended. A play-oriented approach, or an approach which actively encourages children to get involved, which ensures classroom interactions are enabled, may be a better way to go about. And in terms of that, we would, or what we are trying to say is that improved classroom interactions needs to get in within a lot of these edtech interventions as an important design objective. And we have not seen that happening quite a lot, or happening in most cases when we look at edtech initiatives targeted at schools, at school education, particularly schools where most of our students, most of our children go, not the more elite, schools, or schools which are for the higher income households. So that's what I thought I would present, and I'm welcome to take any questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amit sir. And after Professor Kathan's talk about what are the different ways in which we should look at education, now after Amit Prakash sir's deliberation, we would now know how EdTech itself can be used to facilitate some of these aspects which Professor Kathan had highlighted in the earlier part. Now I request Professor Ankur Sarin to talk about the issues related to EdTech from the socio-cultural perspective.
Yeah, it's not just about COVID. The question, as somebody has rightly said, that COVID is acting like an X-ray, which is revealing all kinds of fractures in society today. And I think one of the things that it is also laying bare is, fractures in the education system. The issues of equity and inclusion that I want to talk about with regard to EdTech, particularly because EdTech has become so prominent at this time, are not only limited to this time of COVID. They surely have been there before that, and they probably will be after that, even if there is a time after COVID. One of the things that building on what Professor Amit Prakash was saying, if we truly adhere to what an NCF advocates in terms of a constructivist paradigm, I do believe we would not have been facing this crisis. It is because we continue to believe that education resides in a few people and knowledge resides in a few people, and somehow that has to be just delivered to the rest. That is partially why we are facing a crisis at this time. a school reflects the society that it is a part of. It should be trying to change the society, but somehow in our context, a school ends up mirroring society more. A hierarchical society, a society which is based on sort of divisions as the kind we have, is always going to struggle to create an education system which is truly equitable and truly inclusive. Now, so I'm just going to, as I said, I'm going to limit myself to talking about COVID. Maybe we're doing some surveys and we are building on some information that some of our friends are doing. And I'll just try to share that with you in the next couple of minutes. So this question about how children are families are coping with online education. What I am sharing with you is from a survey that a small NGO, not a large one, but a group of very committed education activists have done in this month of June, where they surveyed around 717 parents, predominantly where the children were going to government schools. What they find in terms of access. So less than 60% actually have an Android phone with internet facility. Now, at one level, you could say, hey, that's a good number. 60% have that number. But if you're talking in the context of a right to education, where every child is supposed to be getting an education, we're basically saying, keep aside everything else, quality, all of that. 40% probably don't have any access at all, and that is reflected in the percentage that is even able to access online homework, etc. As we might expect, this is particularly bad for poor families and those residing in rural areas. Now, this is not something that only schools are facing. Even students at an elite institution like us, we are doing online classes right now. This is something that our students are also facing as well. If you are living in in Jammu and Kashmir today, you don't even have access to 4G. And that is by design. That is, you're not allowed to have 4G. So those are the sort of the barriers that are present when it comes to online education, when it comes to EdTech, even now, despite all the progress that we have made. Now, sure, there are plenty of resources available. Many of them are free, but many languages are just not covered. For example, Kutchi. So in the access survey that we found, the lowest access was in Kutch in the state of Gujarat. And maybe even if they got on, there wouldn't be much available to them. As you might expect, most households do not own a computer or a laptop and rely on smartphones. Right? Now, the question is not also, the first number that I shared with you talked about what percentage had a smartphone. But it's even if you have a smartphone, if you have more than one child, you have two children struggling over the same phone, right? That is if the children actually get the phone from the adult male member of the household to start with. So you can imagine how much of a struggle it is at this point to be able to access. I'm a parent, and this is a constant struggle that plays out in my house. The issue of screen time, the issue of what it does to the eyes of children, what it does to the brains of children, the fact that you are constantly glued onto a screen, like many of us have also been at this time, right? What we've also found talking to children, and this is in Ahmedabad in particular, that other than the more relatively elite schools, the children at this point just don't have access to live online lectures. The interaction is mostly asynchronous, mostly through WhatsApp or some other means like that. What are the teachers sharing with us? One is, I'm a teacher too. I am teaching online at this point. We aren't adequately prepared. Half the time I've been given 3 screens in the classroom that I teach in. I've been given a whiteboard. I've been given a stylus and all of that. Half the time I'm struggling as to where the cursor is. I don't know if, I might just be a Luddite, but I don't know what your experience has been. But the point here is this is a time where everybody is learning, even those who are supposed to be trained, right? Like Amit mentioned, this issue of sort of, do we know the student is paying attention? Is there feedback to the teacher? How, in the absence of other cues, how does the teacher know that the child is engaged or not? I don't know when I am teaching my class what my students are doing. Are they paying attention to me? They seem to be sort of transfixed, but they might very well be doing is typing on the keyboard or typing some other paper when I am speaking to them when the lecture is going on. So this is a time which we find ourselves in a true crisis when and this is time in children's lives which is not going to come back. These are grades that are not, these are learning opportunities that are being lost. And the long-term impacts of this are going to be fairly severe. It is going to leave lasting impacts on the children. It's going to leave lasting impacts on the ecosystem. If you are in Gujarat, you would know, for instance, that private schools have decided to go on a strike. I mean, today it's a day that almost all schools are on strike. And going forward, the schools are striking because the state government has come out with sort of fairly strict policy measures, which include saying there will be no fees collected from March onwards. So we also have in this time, we have an intersection of all these elements, the social, the economic, the education, and the question of how will schools survive if they're not allowed to pay fees? How will parents pay fees if they have not been allowed to earn an income, or they've been deprived of their earnings for a substantial amount of time? This is all intersecting at this point. Where we are to go it's going to require a major reorientation. I don't think business as usual is at all possible at this point. Until and unless we really change our attitude in terms of also how we believe education should be done, who it is being done for, whether it should be done, it's okay to do it in private hands, and whether instead we need a much greater involvement of the public or the government. Unless we rethink many of these basic fundamental elements, I think we are going to be missing the most important issues that we currently face today. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarin. And there are several issues in terms of socio-cultural aspects, and EdTech might not be as proposed panacea as it promises to be, but what to make how to make maximum out of this, I'm going to talk about some of these things in the coming slides. Let me share the screen with the presentation. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you. And after Professor Kathan's talk about educational ecosystem and how EdTech can be a tool to enhance the transformation of that ecosystem, then Professor Amit actually talked about there are some ways in which this transformation can happen. But there are some limitations to this transformation, and those limitations were rightly highlighted by Professor Ankur Sarin, especially with respect to the socio-cultural aspect and the technological access aspect. What I will talk about is many of our interventions talk about impact, the measurement of that impact, and many of the funders look for these keywords and the key data, key statistics. Here, I would talk about those aspects of access. So what is the impact? Where do we want to have the impact? How to measure the impact? Though that aspects of EdTech I will talk about. So EdTech, as we all have heard for so many years now, like in healthcare, EdTech has a lot of promises. Promises in terms of standardization. As Professor Amit highlighted, there are n number of schools across 10 talukas, and all of them have one teacher who gives, who prepares the slides according to or videos according to the curriculum, and then that is broadcasted across the schools for all the children. This is standardization, and it aligns with scale, because technology when we see penetration of mobile phone. Now, potentially every child who has the access to mobile phone in the family can access education material, and that is what is the promise of edtech. But as Professor Kathan and Professor Amit highlighted, most of these are looked at from the supply side. A lot of things which are on the demand side get neglected, for example, which Professor Ankur Sarin highlighted. So EdTech has a lot of promises, but there are also a lot of misses. And when we talk about access, we are going to look about how are these misses identified, how are these misses, how should we put attention to these misses, and how should we measure those aspects. So there are some questions which as Professor Ankur was highlighting, there are a lot of questions which have emerged in terms of EdTech boom which we have seen in the COVID times. So parent asking for initially increasing the duration, like to occupy the child for more time, and then some parents asking for decreasing the duration of the technology enabled classrooms, then school being asked to limit the duration of virtual class by the government or the local authorities, parents asking for lowering the fees, government asking the schools for lowering the fees, etc. There was also issue raised by Professor Ankur Sarin, who has the control in the class. In the physical presence, it is usually assumed that teacher will have the control in the class, but who has the control in virtual presence? Any one of the student can just switch off and say connectivity issues and log off. So there are issues related to technology implementation. Then technology adoption by teachers and students, as in the previous presentation Professor Ankur was saying, teachers bhi seekh rahe hain, they are also learning, students are also learning. So it's a very different ecosystem which is emerging now. We have talked about teachers and students in the classroom, but what about parents? Because they are also important stakeholders when the school itself shifts to the home. Access to devices, data, electricity, these are all which Professor Ankur Sarin talked about. We all assume that digital penetration, who has the mobile phone has got access to education. But is mobile phone access universal? All of these are assumptions which we can talk about. Then what are the capabilities of children in terms of handling interaction, peer learning, all those things which he or she was looking forward to when they go to school? How do we actually engage them in this aspect, tacit learning, which Professor Amit Prakash was talking about? How do we enable that, which he beautifully highlighted in the third case, which was on the blind students. So let us dwell on this aspect of concept of access, which we have whenever we talk about ed tech or health tech. We talk about enabling access to quality education, access by all the people, spread across the society, socio-economic strata. You don't spread across geographical locations. So that is what is broad understanding of access. Now, to break down this access into the dimensions on which we can measure access is very important, because that is how we can ensure that how our technology has performed vis-a-vis without technology. So for example, what are the dimensions of access? The literature says that there are 4 dimensions of access, and this is across development sector, whether it is health or whether it is education. So when we talk about geographical access, even a villager who has a mobile phone but cannot go to school because of, say, distance or weather conditions or COVID conditions, can have access to quality education or health advice. So this is what we mean by geographical access. So here, through teacher videos, through circulation of notes, access to internet can provide access to quality education. Then there is a top aspect of financial, how much price one has to pay to access. So again, here beautifully, if there are so many courses available, MOOCs, Coursera, EdServe, etc., which give you courses for free. You might have to pay something for certification, but compare that with in in-class education, if I want to go to, go and access those sites. Tuitions, now lot of these aspects like badges we have to pay, but there are some other aspects like unacademy, lot of lectures available are for free. So any person sitting in village who cannot afford to go to tuition classes can access these videos. So financial access, there is a huge possibility, huge potential in terms of edtech. Then there are but these are the two main topics which are highlighted, dimensions which are highlighted. What is not highlighted is the other two dimensions, which is availability. Again, availability, there is a huge promise. Can I access education or health anytime? For example, the teacher uploads the video in the morning, or there is a live class in the morning, but in the morning father goes out for work and I don't have access to mobile. When he comes back, can I actually look at the lecture? And if I have missed the school, can I go to the school once again, go back to the videos? So that is aspect of availability. Acceptability, as Professor Ankur was talking about, in Kutchi, can I have access to education in my own acceptable terms, like language, or for disabled, like learning disabled or blind, which Professor Amit Prakash was talking about. Their approach to earn education or learn is very different from any other person. So that is what is the dimension of acceptability. Now we have seen that EdTech actually allows these four dimensions to be addressed very well. But there are issues with these four dimensions because these are very restrictive. When we look at, and we will come to those dimensions, the other dimensions which are not mentioned in the literature later on, but let us look at the levels of intervention of access. Normally, when we talk about, most of the time, we talk about technology, design and implementation. Do we have a smartphone? Do we have a lecture? Do we have a recording, YouTube videos, easy learning mode, etc.? These are all design and implementation of technology. This is what the technologically deterministic mindset, that if I have technology, if I have content, and if I have internet access, the education will be provided. But what we miss is all the other levels of intervention for access. For example, policy. When we look at policy, is both at institutional level, like boards, educational institutions, or organizations like school. Who can teach? Are these teachers certified? Are they accredited? Do schools have to have accreditation to start tele-education? How do we ensure non-cyberbullying, or how can we prevent cyberbullying? How can we ensure privacy and confidentiality of data? What about fees? How much difference should the schools have when it comes to online versus offline? These are the policy aspects, and many of the times policy aspects are usually neglected. Then there is human resource aspects, which Professor Amit Prakash beautifully highlighted, that when the broadcasting was done of the lectures in the first case, the students felt very comfortable when the local teacher was present in the class, because they wanted interaction and they wanted physical presence just for the mental support, that somebody is there to solve our doubt. In the second part also, he said teachers were trained for this delivery. So human resource aspect is one thing which is very much neglected, training of teachers, for example. And there is also one more aspect which is much more subtle, but very important, is the technology people, the administrators, the coordinators, those who ensure that technology is flawlessly functioning. That actually, when I was doing my work in telemedicine, I found that those people, rather than doctors, are more important for functioning of telemedicine. So if you have a backup of people who can control technology for the doctors, that is the key success factor for all telemedicine intervention wherever I have studied. So we look at human resource at a very subtle and nuanced way. Then there is a very interesting concept called space and place. Space represents physical dimension. For example, a stage where it is surrounded by benches. Now this stage surrounded by benches can be a classroom, or this can be a performance where comedy acts are performed. Now that is and the same space can be used for both things. Place as a concept includes the social and the emotional aspects of it. For example, when we are sitting in a classroom type of setting and suddenly somebody starts performing a stand-up comedy there, we say that it is out of place. We don't say it is out of space, because expectation, the social aspects, the emotional aspects, the psychological aspects talk about place. That is what is the place in a classroom, in a education sector, in a road, in a hospital, etc. So for example, when we look at telemedicine system design, it is very important for the hospitals to design system in such a way that person feels that he is going to a clinic rather than to any say virtual setting. For example, when we link to this conference, when you see there are the setup in the virtual world is like a normal conference, and that place has been created within the virtual space. Similarly, when Professor Amit Prakash was talking about how these places look like, the photographs which he was showing, how the class is structured, that is very much important. And that aspect is important for tacit learning, where can I accommodate peer-to-peer learning, peer-to-peer interaction in those things. So whenever we talk about design at tech, the space place concept also becomes very important. And lastly, but not the least, we have the students, where we talk about who are the students, what are their capabilities. Are these students physically challenged like blind students, or learning disability? So we have to design curriculum and things for them. For example, in Kutch, when I want to design content for Kutch, it should be taken into account that their language is very different from, say, normal Gujarati, which is prevalent in that stage. So now how we have to think about access from the students' points of view in terms of how students are transformed. As Professor Kathan was telling, it's a psychological improvement also, it's aspirational improvement also. How do we transform them rather than talking about memorizing? So these are the levels of intervention. Once these levels are clear, then it comes to how can we measure across these levels. And normally when we talk about measurement, we talk about what to measure. What to measure, usually we look for some or the other framework, framework for measurement. Look for aspects that are enhanced. For example, in geographical, in terms of financial, in terms of availability, access, and acceptability. What are the aspects which I have influenced? We can look at what are the technology potentials when we look at technology potentials as manifested in other industries. For example, IT industry, technology, how technology has transformed IT organizations. So all of those things we can look at and think about how we can transform healthcare, education sector. There is also aspect of many of these impact assessment people talk about cost benefit analysis. So cost benefit analysis in short means what was there with technology and what is there without technology. We add cost of technology and see what is the impact of the change. We normally look for quantification, how to quantify this change. Do we suppose if I spend 100 rupees, do I get value worth more than 100 rupees? So that is largely the focus of measurement impact. But that misses a lot, because it is usually looked at from the espoused benefit. So when I design technology, I usually have something in my mind, and then I design technology, and then I will measure accordingly. For example, how many lectures, how many students, how many hours of content, how many hours were seen by students, what is the geographical reach, etc., etc. These are the espoused benefit. But when we look at potential, it is much beyond that. So framework usually talk about only quantitative. For example, system features. The system allows data to track the progress of the student. Then there is a source of value from this system feature, which is reduced cost of repetition and focus on weak areas only. You don't need to now work on trigonometry. The student is very good. You just have to work on the linear equation aspect. The benefit is always there, because you now eliminate redundancy. You focus only on those aspects, so the student learning become faster, the school's resources are saved, conserved, time conservation, etc. So this is what is the normal conceptualization of impact measurement. But when we look at nuance, the measurement of impacts, lot of things are usually neglected. For example, value sensitivity. Have I designed technology where each and every student, irrespective of the language, socio-cultural aspect, socio-economic aspect, etc., is taken care of? What is the community which I am serving? How they access education? Institutionalization. This is one dimension which is usually very much neglected. In one of my projects, where I had seen at free open software services, free open source software services, which was adopted in 2 states in India. In one of the states, it had a very different impact as compared to another state. The state where it had a good impact, where it had no impact, there were a lot of differences. Because when I look at impact, say adoption of, instead of Microsoft, I start using Linux. So this is what is open source about. I save money, but the principle behind, or the value, or the metaphysical thing about open source is that it allows people to collaborate, it allows people to meddle with the technology, to work with the technology. So what we found, that unless and until you change the processes and the policies, so the place where FOSS had a positive impact was where teacher student and student interaction were facilitated through this FOSS. If it was not done, it was as bad or as good as Microsoft. So the philosophy did not change, only the superficial level changed. That is what is the talk about institutionalization. There should be a change in mindset when it comes to say self-efficacy of the teachers, how I handle technology, self-efficacy of the student, how I learn, how I carry out peer-to-peer interaction over edtech, etc. Database decision making, again for the hospital administration and the decision makers, it is very important parameter. Does technology enable these aspects of changing in mindset? Because if you have value sensitivity, institutionalization, change in processes and policies, and change in mindset, then only the things will be sustainable. Otherwise, it is like adoption of any other mode of traffic and mode of traveling, and once that mode is it's just like going by a car or a bullock cart, does not make a difference. You have to reach point A to point B. So I think that is where the impact, when we talk about access, these dimensions of access, which are related to non-technical aspects of the social or the ecological or the ecosystem aspects of education, with Professor Kathan, Shukla, Professor Amit, and Professor Ankur talked about, are more important as compared to the usual aspects of access. So that's why how to measure should not only include frameworks and quantitative, but also go deeper into the demand side, how people are using technology, because that is where the potential comes through. Lord Hanuman was narrating the story after the Ramayana happened. Sita was sent back to Ayodhya with Ram. He was narrating the story of this Ravan Vadh to his mother. So his mother asked, but why these much initiatives and building bridges and taking an army? You could have just, with the fling of your tail, you could have finished off Lanka, the whole Lanka, and you could have brought back Sita. Why was the need? What was the need to do all these things? So the Hanuman says, nobody told me to do that. Okay, they told me to bring mountains, to build a bridge, and I was doing whatever they were telling me to do that. There was a lot of potential which was not exploited. And when we take a very technologically deterministic view, we always look at what we think the person should do rather than what the person can do. And that is where the qualitative aspect, the nuanced aspect of people using the technology becomes more important. From output perspective, usually we look at output in terms of measurement. It is important to understand the process, because more than intended, the unintended constitutes the potential. So I think we are short of time. I will conclude with this, that access and hence value is multidimensional. Look for potential. Demand side issues are usually overlooked, and focus on user value sensitivity is important, because those aspects of institutionalization, process, etc., will be the road towards sustainability. I think we are dot on time. We may have some time for question answer if Anchal allows.
Thank you so much, Professor Ankur, Professor Kathan, Professor Rajesh, and Professor Amit for such an engaging session. I think all of us are hearing that EdTech. Yeah. Like EdTech is the new normal, and it has a lot of potential, but you highlighted the challenges along that come with EdTech. So I see that a lot of questions have been answered by the speakers already in the Q&A section. I request the participants, if there are any more questions, you can please post them on the Q&A and the speakers can take them up.
So Anchal, if you can select some questions. If they are for specific panelists, then you can direct them to the specific panelist, and you can also, if there are some burning questions, then you can also connect video to the participants.
All the professors were very active in the session, so they have already answered all the questions which were asked. If the audience has any more questions, please post them on the Q&A section. There is one question from Anjum Afroz. The question is, how do you all see EdTech for rural areas in the upcoming decade?
Professor Amit Prakash and Ankur Sarin sir, will you?
Yeah, so this is Amit, and I think it is important, EdTech, at least in a context like ours, if it has to sustain, and not only EdTech, in fact, the larger technology ecosystem, if it has to sustain, it has to make sense for rural areas. Schools in rural areas have issues of various kinds that has been highlighted, and EdTech needs to engage with those aspects explicitly rather than wishing them away, rather than saying that, we can create content and then all the inefficiencies of the system will go away. So those kinds of broad brush generalizations and a top-down approach needs to give way to a better understanding and appreciation of what are the strengths and what is it that technology can say help with in a rural context. So I would feel and I would assume that those EdTech ventures and products which incorporate the richness and diversity that exists in our rural areas in a more explicit way they will be able to survive and they will be able to contribute in making a difference in the overall educational outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have another question, which is what could be the role of the government in overcoming the challenges which were discussed by you?
Professor Ankur, he has a view about government many times, so I think.
No, I think the government has a most critical role to play on this. And actually, I mean, if you look at what the MHRD guidelines are with regard to online education, I think which have just been shared, which have come from the NCRT, I think it's a very sensible set of guidelines if you were to actually adhere to them. The national curriculum framework, which came about in at least 15 odd years ago, it's a very sensible framework. It's the right kind of framework which is comparable to any of the frameworks or curriculums that we have in any part of the world, and the most progressive parts of the world, whether it be in terms of creativity, innovation, etc. I think the deeper question that we have to grapple with is, we have to ask this question to ourselves. When we talk to our own children, do we talk with a sense of superiority, a sense of hierarchy, a sense of we know it, you listen to me, you follow, you need to learn, or do we even engage with our own children in a manner that is, for instance, to use the language that is being used today, constructivist? Do we give our children the ability to make decisions for themselves? And I think till we start asking these questions, until we as a society, we as individuals, we as parents, elders, whatever, start changing these things, the government can only guide us in a certain direction, but we are not going to move there. I mean, like with the constitution, a very progressive constitution, but it can't flatten, it can't create equity in the society by itself.
I think the aspect of role of government is largely in the terms of designing the policy and facilitating the people and the institutions and the organizations to implement those things. So not act as roadblocks, but act as facilitators.